If you care about where America is heading, not just the headlines, not just the election cycles, not just the daily outrage, but the deep structural shifts happening underneath the surface, you're in the right place. On this channel, I break down the American economy, finance, cities, infrastructure, and everyday life in a way that is deeply researched but actually understandable. I don't chase noise. I study systems. I look at balance sheets, migration flows, power grids, legal battles, because that's where the real story is. If that kind of analysis matters to you, I genuinely appreciate your support. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and hit the like button. It may seem small, but it helps this content reach more people who are trying to understand what's really happening. Because what we're talking about today is not just inflation. It's not just federal debt. It's not just culture wars. In 2026, the United States is not facing a single crisis. It's navigating a structural stress test at the state level. And in this video, we're going to answer a very direct question. Which states are closest to the edge, and why? We'll look at fiscal exhaustion and reserve depletion, grid instability and infrastructure breakdown, federal, state legal conflict, demographic hollowing, and the growing rhetoric of national divorce. And toward the end, I'm going to lay out clearly which states face the most immediate structural risks, and which ones are better positioned than people think. Stay with me, because the conclusion isn't obvious, and it's not what cable news is telling you. Let's begin. 2026, not a collapse, but a structural stress test. The United States projected institutional resilience for decades. There were periods of recession. Crises erupted and subsided. Shocks were absorbed by the system. It was unaffected by the financial crisis of 2008. It was unaffected by the pandemic. However, 2026 feels different because of the simultaneous activation of several pressure points rather than a single catastrophic event. The deficit of the federal government is $1.9 trillion. The public debt now stands at almost 101% of GDP. Federal funding is increasingly being consumed by debt servicing expenses. Additionally, Washington redistributes suffering rather than absorbing it when it is under such pressure. The states are increasingly bearing the brunt of such shift. States are unable to print money, in contrast to the federal government. Every year, the majority must balance their budgets. When federal transfers slow or shift, they don't have the same flexibility. This is where structural fragility begins. The scissors effect: revenues flatten, obligations rise. As a percentage of GDP, federal spending currently above long-term historical trends. The cost of servicing the debt increases due to rising borrowing costs. This entails stricter funding formulas and fewer discretionary awards. Restructuring Medicaid and SNAP financing through legislation places more accountability on state budgets. Here's the catch, though. In 2021 and 2022, tax receipts were exceptionally high in many states. The asset markets were flourishing. The tax on capital gains increased. Local economies were swamped by federal stimulus. As a result, a new fiscal baseline appeared. It wasn't a new baseline, though. It was a spike. Growth is now slowing. The asset markets are erratic. Growth in revenue is slowing. However, spending commitments for retirement, healthcare, and education continue to be structurally high. I refer to this as the scissors effect. Lines of revenue flatten. Lines of obligation continue to grow. And when that gap widens long enough, states face three options. 1. Cut services. 2. Raise taxes. 3. Drain reserves. Some states are already deep into option 3. States closest to fiscal exhaustion. Let's be direct. If we rank states by structural fiscal fragility in 2026, 3 stand out immediately, but for different reasons. 1. Pennsylvania, reserve depletion risk. One of the best illustrations of a state on the verge of a fiscal turning point is Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro, the governor, has suggested using a large portion of the rainy day fund to balance the budget. That makes sense on paper. On a structural level, however, it indicates imbalance. Reserves are made to withstand brief shocks. It is an indication that recurring revenues are inadequate when they finance recurring operations. According to independent estimates, if current trends continue, Pennsylvania's reserves may run out within the next several fiscal cycles. Compared to what many headlines portray, that brings Pennsylvania closer to a fiscal cliff. This is not a scenario of a dramatic collapse. The maneuvering room is gradually getting smaller. 2. California, revenue volatility risk. The vulnerability of California is distinct. Capital gains, especially from high-income technology earners and investors, are a major component of its tax structure. California is booming while markets are doing well. Revenues fall precipitously when markets correct. A sustainable deficit has been forecast by Governor Gavin Newsom. However, structural deficiencies may become far more pronounced during the next 2 fiscal years, according to legislative analysts. Spending levels are not the only problem. It is the concentration of volatility. A disproportionately large portion of money is generated by a small percentage of taxpayers. Tens of billions of dollars could be lost in revenue in California if AI-related stocks decline drastically. That does not imply the collapse of California. It does, however, indicate that it is quite vulnerable to cycles in the financial markets. Not insolvent, but structurally vulnerable due to volatility. 3. Illinois, federal conflict and fiscal engineering. Another type of fragility can be seen in Illinois. It has adopted decoupling strategies, separating its tax code from certain federal rules in order to conserve revenue, instead of aggressively depleting reserves. This illustrates the increasing conflict between federal and state taxation. Illinois' finances are not about to collapse. However, it has high pension commitments and little room for error. Structural rigidity and the possibility of legal dispute are its weaknesses. It's not crumbling. It's wrapped tightly. Infrastructure, the quiet trigger. Now let's talk about something even more destabilizing than deficits. Electricity, water, the physical systems that make a state functional. Texas, grid fragility risk. Texas operates under ERCOT, a largely isolated grid structure. A mainly independent grid framework governs operations in Texas. Billions of dollars were spent on solar and battery storage following the winter catastrophe of 2021. However, robust increase in natural gas capacity did not keep pace with increasing demand. The demand for electricity is rising as a result of AI data centers, industrial electrification, growth in population. Peak loads for winter are increasing. Peak summer temperatures are rising. In 2026, Winter Storm Fern brought the system dangerously close to breakdown. Texas is not insolvent. However, it is vulnerable to grid instability structurally. There could be serious financial repercussions if a large blackout occurs during a period of high economic activity. This is not budgetary instability, but infrastructure fragility. However, financial repercussions may result from infrastructure failure. Water infrastructure, a national weakness. Water systems in cities like Atlanta and Richmond are aging due to century-old pipes and treatment facilities that rely on little power redundancy. Drought conditions have affected almost half of the nation. Agriculture, industry, and household use are becoming more competitive for water. Local governments rapidly lose credibility as water reliability deteriorates. Legitimacy is infrastructure, and stability is legitimacy. Migration and the fiscal death spiral. Fiscal maps are changing as a result of domestic migration. Some high-income residents are leaving states with higher taxes. States with lower taxes are growing in population. At the same time, there is less mobility overall due to the lock-in effect caused by extremely low mortgage rates. When individuals do move, it's on purpose. Higher earners tend to be the most mobile households. The remaining tax base is forced to take on greater responsibilities or accept service reductions when they depart a high-cost state. This is how budgetary death spirals start, gradual deterioration rather than panic. The following states are most vulnerable to this dynamic: California, Illinois. In general, high-tax states in the Northeast. States that are growing in population, however, are not exempt. Infrastructure is strained by rapid expansion. Roads, schools, water systems, and grid capacity must all be scaled up in Florida and Texas. Growth can create stress just as decline can. Federalism under stress. There is a growing transactional nature to the relationship between Washington and the states. The willingness of states to contest federal power in court is growing. Conflicts over federal budget requirements, constitutional enforcement, and tariff authority are becoming more heated. Potential conflicts with the Supremacy Clause have arisen in Illinois as a result of state-level remedies against federal agents. This is not a metaphor. It reveals a more profound breakdown in agreement over the borders of sovereignty. The execution of policies slows down when that boundary becomes shaky. Additionally, government becomes increasingly disjointed. The rise of internal secession movements. Geographic fragmentation within states is another trend we are witnessing. Counties in eastern Oregon have decided to consider joining Idaho. Rural counties in southern Illinois have declared their intention to join themselves with Kentucky. Some localities in western Maryland talk about their connections to West Virginia. These initiatives might not be successful. However, they show how internal cohesiveness is eroding. Representation strain is shown when counties no longer feel connected to their state capitals. So, which states are closest to the edge? Let's be clear. In 2026, no significant U.S. state is in danger of going bankrupt. However, some are using fewer structural buffers. Pennsylvania is the state closest to budgetary exhaustion, most vulnerable to fluctuations in revenue. California. Texas is the state most vulnerable to disruptions caused by infrastructure, most stiff in structure and least flexible. Illinois. Everybody faces a distinct kind of danger. Furthermore, none are exempt from federal dynamics. This isn't a collapse in film. The margins are being structurally thinned. Buffer space is frequently what distinguishes fragility from resilience. Buffer space is decreasing in 2026. The global context. All of this unfolds while technological competition accelerates globally. The United States leads in AI research, but scaling AI requires reliable energy infrastructure. If states with major data center clusters face grid instability, economic gains may be constrained. Infrastructure could become the limiting factor, not innovation. Real risk. In 2026, unexpected state bankruptcy is not the true danger. The strain is coordinated. Financial strain, fragility of the infrastructure, fragmentation of the law, differences in demographics. Resilience rapidly decreases when various forces coexist in the same condition. That is the narrative of structure. Therefore, it is more important than ever to comprehend fragility at the state level. If you value this kind of deep, system-level analysis of American cities, finance, infrastructure, and political economy, support the channel. Subscribe, turn on notifications, like the video, because what's happening in 2026 isn't loud enough to dominate headlines, but it may define the next decade. And understanding where the margins are thinning before they disappear is how you stay ahead of the shift.